Good morning, everybody. Morning, hello, hello. So my name is Mark Deakin. I work in the small mid-market, the small medium business team. And actually one of the areas we kind of cover as part of that team is also speaking to people in education. So I have a mixed background at Microsoft. I'm quite well aware of the fact that a number of you, or most of you, are from a technical background. So I actually started in support, supporting Outlook. The first thing I learnt was that if you need to try and fix someone's support problem, kind of giving away a Microsoft secret here actually. If you need to fix a problem a customer has and you're not quite sure what the answer is, with Outlook you can always ask people to do an Outlook/clean views. I'm pretty sure that it does absolutely nothing, but I can say for certain that it did certainly get the customer to go and try that whilst I then tried to figure out what the actual issue was. So I have worked either in technical or with technical teams over a while. At one point I was in marketing. So I kind of swayed slightly to the dark side, but don't think of any less of me for being in marketing. Very much come back now to being a partner technical specialist. And actually, over the 14 years I've been at Microsoft, it all started with very much on-premise kind of software. And the one thing that I've noticed over time is our move towards the cloud has been a lot more quicker than I would have expected. Now, throughout all of this, I'm going to tell you more about the stuff that's cloud related. Certainly, feel free to ask any questions as we go through. If you don't ask any questions, I will continue talking, and nobody wants that, so feel free to jump in. Just stick your hand up. I'll stop talking and I'll answer whatever question it is. So I'm particularly going to talk about Azure and give you a small update on Office 365. So what I wanted to start off with is just obviously give you an idea of what's occurring. So for the agenda, I'll explain a little bit about Azure, how I explain it to people normally. Has anybody used Azure in one way or another? Show of hands. Just me then, excellent, and nice one, excellent. A couple of people from Medhurst, that's always a good sign. Especially the guy that's demoing later. If he hasn't used Azure, that would be quite shocking. So that's good, because everything is hopefully going to be new to you guys. Hopefully trying to answer some of the very initial ideas of what you could use it for. So the way I actually describe Azure is a bunch of Lego bricks. So there are some kind of completed end products there. But for the most part, it's a bunch of Lego bricks that you're going to plug together to make a solution that you need with the help of a partner like Medhurst normally. And so I'm going to give you some of those kind of completed Lego pieces, as it were, so you have an idea of what you could start with. But don't think of this as the only stuff it can do. It's a good start, though. I'll give you an idea of how much it will cost, so to give you indicative costs on whether it's going to cost £500,000 or whether it's going to cost 20 quid in order to do the stuff that I'm telling you, and give you an idea of some next steps. Final thing I'll then go on to is some of the updates with Office 365. Does that kind of sound along the lines of what people were after? Silence is acceptance, brilliant. Okay, so what is Microsoft Azure? So it's part of the Cloud OS platform. Now the marketing bit of my brain likes the sound of that. The technical bit of my brain says, that sounds like a load of crap, what on earth does that mean? And so what we realized is with Windows Server, as stuff was moving to the cloud, we started to realize that Windows Server, as we kind of saw it and thought about it, was starting to become more and more irrelevant to a certain extent. So what we needed to do is to kind of move that on to something that really related to what people wanted to use cloud for. And so one of the first things was a simple change so when you log into a server now, you don't necessarily just see the services that are on that particular server. You sometimes see a list of all of the services across your estate to a certain extent. And so that was the first part of us thinking a server is just not a thing on its own. It's it's part of a bigger system. We then realized that actually that needs to branch then out into cloud as well. So that when you don't want to host something on-premise, and you want to put it somewhere else, so in the cloud, you either need to be able to flex those resources up and down, or for whatever reason you don't want to have that on-premise, then we need some way of being able to do that. And we started to think how we could tie the two together. So something like Office 365 is an obvious move from taking something like Exchange, putting that in the cloud. We needed to do the same with Windows Server as well. And so it's part of that Cloud OS platform. Something that basically you decide, I want a server to do X, and then you decide if it's going to be on-premise or in Azure, or maybe a bit of both, and there's not too much effort to kind of get that working. At a very high level, the thing that people tend to think Azure could be, and it's a good start, is when we're talking about virtual machine workloads, and it does do loads of other stuff, but with simple virtual machine workloads, we'll supply the server and the operating system, the network connectivity and the power, and in some instances, we'll even run it for you as well. Now, you guys are obviously well versed in how to run a server, but for some of our smaller customers that I speak to, they want a server that they can log in, so a domain controller. They want a SQL server, but they have absolutely no idea what it is or why they should want to run that. They just know they need one. And so that's where things like Azure becomes really useful. So get someone else to run it. You can concentrate on the more difficult stuff. We look after the servers, make sure that they run. If a hard disk goes, we have a backup ready for it to move on to. If a network controller goes, you don't need to worry about that. You don't need to order one. You're instantly ready to kind of go. And so really think of it as offloading the kind of commodity, boring, low interest tasks off to Microsoft and off to the partner in this instance. Thing to understand though is it's just not virtual machines. I'm going to talk a lot about those, but it does go into other areas as well. Is there any questions so far? Nope. Okie doke. So, data centers. So we obviously have a number of data centers. I don't believe this is a generic data center photo. The reason you know that is because there appears to be a hubcap from what I can tell in the data center. You don't tend to get those in there. This is pretty much what ours turn up like actually. They'll make them outside and then get a crane to stick them inside the data center. But for our data centers, we have 17 of those worldwide. Each of them contains up to 16 data center buildings. Each of those buildings is the size of one American football field, which is big enough to park 2 jumbo jets in if you wanted to. Although we try not to do that because that means we need to invoke disaster recovery if that was to happen. But you could, if you wanted to, park a jumbo jet or 2 inside them. And so in each region, we can have up to 600,000 servers. The reason I'm telling you this is because we do have conversations with people where they say, yeah, but you haven't really been doing the whole data center thing for very long. AWS has been doing that for years, or Amazon have. It isn't really something you've been into. We're heavily invested in this, so don't have the fear that it's something we're going to suddenly move on to something else. There's a lot of investment. The other thing is we have been doing data centers since about the 1980s. I think it's 81 if I remember correctly. Things like Hotmail. In fact, there's a guy in our team that we work in who, when he goes through this as your presentation, he's quite happy to say he is actually wasn't born when our first data center was there, which is a 36-year-old is a massively irritating thing to hear. But he revels in the fact that we've had data centers for longer than he's kind of existed. So we have the capacity to be able to move up or down as much as you kind of need to. There are actually, when you take some of those regions, upwards of 19 data centers available. So what are they used for? Let's go back to that one. So for the few people that might use Bing every so often in this room, obviously in the other buildings it's used quite a lot, but if you have ever gone to Bing, that's obviously sitting in our data center. oddly enough, you've probably all used Bing in one way or another. You'll just be blissfully unaware that it's being used, whether it's on a Windows phone or whether you've been using Outlook, for example, and it brings up one of the maps when it notices that you have an address in an email. That will go off to the Bing service as an example. We obviously use it for Azure. We have all of our OneDrive data sitting in there. Skype's another good example. So Skype are now able to do some of the stuff they previously couldn't before they had, when they had their own data centers, before we purchased them. So things like Skype Translator. Has anyone heard or aware of Skype Translator? No? Excellent, few people. Cool. I put my hands up for everything because it shows people what to do. If I don't do it, people don't do it, weirdly enough. Skype Translator, as you would expect, can join a call. So we do it in Spanish, French, German, Mandarin, I think is the other one. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, we don't do it in Czech yet. So my wife is Czech. It'd be massively useful for me to be able to speak to my in-laws. And so when Skype does Czech, then I'm sure I'll be doing that. Up until now, they kind of don't know what I'm saying to them. That's probably a good thing, I'd say. So maybe we don't need it to be in Czech ever. Skype Translator, you can actually have the Skype Translator service. It's available on beta, so you should, certainly if you know anyone that speaks another one of the languages I rattled off. Skype Translator, person joins a call, or rather Skype Translator service does. And as you talk in English, it will translate it on the fly, speak to the other person in their language, let's say German. They'll reply in German, and then you'll hear it and see it back in English again. That sort of computing power wasn't available to Skype before, and now they use our data centers, it is. And what I want you to get from this is a lot of people worry about the fact that are we going to make sure the data centers are running? We use them ourselves because we have Office 365 running on there, and a lot of our execs are sitting on Office 365. We have upwards of 250,000 mailboxes that sit in Office 365. You can be sure our data center will keep up and running, because if it doesn't, the execs can't get to their email, and they'll go and find the person that should keep it running and make it a condition of their continued employment to ensure that it's kept up and running. So have no fear around whether we're going to kind of concentrate on keeping these running. We rely on it heavily ourselves, and therefore you'd be sitting in the same kind of system as ours. So what can I use? What can I use Azure for? Is perhaps the ultimate question. So the key ones that we see for small and mid-sized customers, and I would hazard a guess it's the same for yourselves, is these 4 areas. And it's the first 3, obviously the ones in red, that I tend to concentrate on when I speak to people. So the first one is data backup. Has anybody looked at Azure data backup at all? Few people, okay. For the one guy that has, when you've looked at the pricing, it's worth going to have a look at the pricing again, because it's just reduced massively. So the first thing is, if you have a look at the Azure services to figure out if there's something that you can use. If there isn't, or it's too expensive, I would recommend you keep on going back to the site, or at least subscribe to the blog. That's what I tend to do. Because if it's too expensive, they normally come down in cost pretty soon. So for commodity services, we'll match Amazon. And the second thing is, if the service doesn't do something that you need it to, within the next 6 months, it will start to support it. So I've had to go back to partners quite a lot and say, for example, we don't support multi-site VPN, and now we do. We didn't support this type of backups, a DPM, and now we do. So the one thing I would say is, when looking at Azure, sign up for the Azure blog, because the speed with which changes come out is pretty rapid. So for data backup, what we're talking about here is currently it's files and folders. So it's not system state. But it does mean you can back up files and folders from a file server or somewhere similar. and back them up into Azure. Kind of think of it as a replacement for your tape if you're still using that kind of technology. If you want to, you can seed the data. So if you've got a big amount of data that you need to back up in the first instance, you can send that to us on a disk, as in a hard disk, obviously not a floppy disk. Then you could send that to us, and then we'll seed that in the data center for you. But you can use Azure backup, or the data backup piece here, to back up data into Azure. So there is a restriction currently. That restriction is you can only do it for 99 years. Does anybody see 99 years being a problem at all? No, excellent, nobody put their hand up. Good-o. So we can only back up to about 99 years if I remember correctly. And there's different schedules you can go for: weekly, monthly, yearly. As an example, I did this presentation probably about 3-4 weeks ago. We didn't support 99 years, we only supported 9 years. So again, the kind of pace with which we're updating this, really quick. Question?
You say you can't do system state at the moment, obviously that's quite important to us as managers. Could you set a staging post on your network where you did a backup to this folder and transfer that folder to that?
Yeah, so I'll attempt to repeat the question for you. If we can't do system state, that's quite important. Could you create a system state backup in a file and then back that up into Azure? And the answer is yes, you can. Yeah, you can. I mean, if you're running the VM in Azure anyway, then you can take a snapshot, and there's various ways of doing that. But yeah, you can basically send that file up there, and then that's backed up remotely and stored in our data center. When it's stored in our data center, by default, if I remember correctly, you're kind of restricted to, initially, it's only in one of our data centers, but it's replicated 3 times round. If you wanted to, I believe you can then set that actually to be in same data center, in the same region. So those are 2 data centers that are up to 100 miles apart from each other. And if you really wanted to, you can do it in a different continent. So your backup is relatively safe, I would say, is the kind of thing to get from that. Relatively as in massively safe. If you compare that to what you might be using at the minute tape, then actually I've had one partner recently told me that they had someone that's doing tape backups, wasn't interested in Azure. They've got a system for tape backups, it's all good. So what they used to do is Jeff would take the tape, he'd drive home, he'd leave it at home, and all was good in the world, and they kind of did some restores, make sure it's all working, good kind of backup practice. Jeff left and Julie came in. It's probably not their names, but let's go with that anyway. Julie came back, Julie started. Julie doesn't have a car. This was actually in London, and she gets the train. So she would pick up the tapes, she'd take them home, that's all good. We knew the backups were working, we didn't need to worry about it. They had a massive system failure, got out the tapes. Turns out the tapes had been wiped each time they were going onto or near the train track. So somewhere along the lines, it was actually wiping their tapes. So even if you have tape backup and you think that's relatively safe at the minute, start to look at things like Azure backup in this instance. The second area is disaster recovery. So disaster recovery, amongst other things, includes something called Azure Site Recovery. Who uses Hyper-V in one way or another? Excellent. I was a bit worried there'd only be one hand then. For Hyper-V, if you have System Center, you can still use this. But actually, we've now made a recent change so that you don't need System Center in place. We'll talk about it a little bit more, and it'll be demoed. But basically, if I have a Hyper-V, I have a VM sitting in Hyper-V, I'm able to use ASR to have that moved to, or rather be replicated into Azure. And then I can either decide to start it there, or at least start on another Hyper-V server. But I don't want to take away too much of Dave's presentation, so I won't go into that too much. But Azure Site Recovery, for actually a really kind of cheap cost, we're talking a maximum of, I think, about £17 per replicated server. And with that, you even get some of the space free that's running in Azure when you need to run it. So ASR, Azure Site Recovery, is another thing to look at. The last is something as simple as deployment of virtual machines. So if you're using Hyper-V, then as long as your Hyper-V, as long as your VMs are in a VHD format and they're Gen 1, I would say that's current because we could always change that. As long as they're Gen 1 and they're VHDs, you can upload them to Azure, attach them to a VM in Azure, and just start the machine straight up and running. And the good thing about this, actually, in comparison to some of the other solutions that you have available to you, are that you can actually move those backwards and forwards. So you can have them sitting in Hyper-V on-premise, move it into Azure, have it running for when it needs the extra resources, and then very easily shut that machine down, move it back onto on-premise, and start it on Hyper-V locally again. So for virtual machines, you can actually move them between cloud and on-premise, backwards and forwards, pretty much as you like. That's a good example of like where we're trying to embrace the hybrid idea rather than saying it's a one-way move into Azure. Should you need to, you can actually get some pretty beefy machines. So the geek, I think, within me, saw that we had something we call a G5, which is basically a gigantic VM. I'm sure it stands for something else, but it's a gigantic virtual machine. And I have a virtual machine that cost me £5 an hour, which is relatively kind of cheap, that if I wanted to, it runs with 488 gig of RAM and 32 processors, which is pretty quick if you want to run something like Minecraft or Doom or something of that ilk. Cost about a £5. Literally, if I, and I have started it up a couple of times because it just makes me giggle when you go into Task Manager and you see all the 32 cores. You can run that kind of size server if you needed to. The whole idea being is that if you have a spiky requirement, so you have a requirement to have a server that's very beefed up, but only for, let's say, a certain amount of term time, you can have that. And then between terms, so when everybody else is on holiday, but not you guys, presumably, then you can move that down to a smaller virtual machine. But VMs is where a lot of people tend to start, so the virtual kind of machine idea. Well, it's a little bit scary. I can see it up there, so it's coming there, good. The last thing actually is identity. So for identity, what we can do is we can enable single sign-on. That single sign-on could be with other Microsoft products. Perhaps more interestingly and useful for the rest of you is it's actually non-Microsoft products as well. So I met with a partner quite recently who not so politely said he would never sell anything Microsoft. So I thought this is a challenge for me. I'm gonna turn him round. I almost managed to turn him round. But what he did do is he sold Google Docs, Dropbox, Google Apps, Dropbox, and Cisco WebEx. He can use identity in Azure to be able to sign on to all three of those with one username and password. So for where you guys are needing to offer single sign-on, identity in Azure is something to look at. There's something like 2,600 cloud-based apps that we now connect into. And if there isn't one that you need listed in there, if you remember markde@microsoft.com, email me. I'll go and email the person that looks after that list, and I can go and try and get it added. I can't say it'll happen instantly, but they're pretty quick to add them. About a year and a half ago, there was 500, and there's now, like I say, about 2,500 actually. So they'll add them pretty quickly. But the main ones I see used are the three on the left-hand side. So data backup, disaster recovery, deployment in VMs. Any questions so far? No? So how much does it cost? So this is these figures are actually relevant from the 1st of April. So we've recently dropped the cost actually of Azure. So if we have a new server, that new server has 500 gigabyte hard disk, and we want to back up 100 gig of that. To give you an idea of the pricing, you basically for every 500 gig. That's going to be £6 and let's say 11p there. So £6 and 11p. And that's per 500 gig. That kind of keeps us happy because we're under that 500 gig. We've only got 100 gig we're going to back up. And then you need to then take into account the storage cost. So when you do that storage cost, actually Azure backup will compress it. So this is like a kind of worst case scenario. And for storage cost, unfortunately, we do charge people the exorbitant price of 1.5p per gigabyte. And so 1.5p or thereabouts per gigabyte times 100 plus the £6 and 9p is basically £7.60 to back up 100 gig. Actually, as you start to back up more, you'll see the price from the old way it used to work to the new way. It's massively, massively cheaper than it used to be previously. But 100 gig, it's going to cost you £7.60 per month to back up. Worst case, because we're going to compress it. Does that kind of make sense as to how much a backup cost would be at a very high level? Cool, excellent. I'm going to go silence is acceptance again on that one. Yep. Yep. Yeah, so we've got a 500 gig server with 500 gig hard disk, but we don't need to back up the whole server. All we're doing is backing up, let's say, the files and folders on it, and that's the bit that's 100 gig. If you needed to back up the whole server, so you were doing a system state backup. Yep, so the 500 gig price would be 5 times 7. Yeah, about 11. Yeah, I can do the maths another time to figure that one out for you. But yeah, it would. It's basically 500 times 11.5p. No, 500 times 1.5 pence plus your £6 and 9p. Yeah. Sorry? Cool. Just trying to, cool, excellent. So the other thing to be aware of is, just to reiterate the point, is you've got to take into account compression in that as well. So take that into account when you're thinking this is kind of worst case. The second bit is how do you price up a virtual machine? So when you price up a virtual machine, I've gone for you need to figure out the size that you want. So if you go onto azure.microsoft.com, you go to pricing, virtual machines, it will show you different specs of machine. So I've gone for a medium VM, which if I remember correctly is 2 cores and 3.75 gig of RAM. On that machine, it actually comes with a 135 gig hard disk with a C drive and a temporary drive as well. Don't stick anything on the temporary drive that you want to keep. It's temporary so that when you restart it, everything disappears off of there. But the C drive, where the OS is obviously kind of kept. And in this instance, we've also added a terabyte of blob storage. So there's a terabyte of disk added in there as well. The way to calculate that and how much it's going to cost you is you take the cost for an average month. So for an A2, actually on the website, it tells you it's circa £86. It's worth knowing that 86 is based on 744 hours. So if it's February, you're going to pay less. If it's a long month, that's the amount that you're going to pay. And if the clocks go back, it's going to cost you an extra 11.5p. So look at it at about 11.5p an hour for a standard server that you might use. You take that cost. Yep. Of course. Yep. What's the difference and what is it? Yep. So actually, there's a couple of different types of storage. There is blob storage, there is page storage, and there's tables. So if you want to attach a hard disk to a VM, you're going to go for page blobs and disks. It's just something that is represented as a disk that you can attach to a machine. If you wanted to store data and you just wanted a data store to put that in, then you can go for the cheaper kind of option. So as an example, if you use a third-party backup piece of software, because it knows how to reference where that backup is stored, how long it's been there, where to go and get it from if you need to restore it, you can store it in the cheaper storage mechanism, which is not blob storage, it's the tables or the other one. Basically, I'm not explaining that very well. What you can do is, if you know where you're going to store that data, and you have a third-party app that is going to manage the accessing of that storage, then you go for the cheaper storage option. If you need it to appear as a disk in a VM, that's what blob storage is. So this is the more expensive of the three kind of storage mechanisms. If I was to write an app, we have a partner that's wrote an app that takes pictures as people come into car parks, like McDonald's. And you go in there, they take a picture of your number plate, they store that in Azure storage, and because they know how to send to it and how to pull the pictures out of there, they can use the cheaper storage. And this one is actually a normal kind of disk. Probably, if that doesn't make sense, I can try and explain it, yeah? So think of this blob storage as a disk that you can add to a VM. So if I have 1 terabyte, if I take the 3.2p per gigabyte we charge for blob storage, times that by 1024, that's 32 quid. We'll round it up to £33. So the most you would pay for a virtual machine is 86 plus 33, i.e. 119. Thing to be aware of here is, again, is that £33, we would only charge you £33 if you used every single corner, byte, bit of that hard disk. For the hard disk, you only pay for what you use. So if that 1 terabyte disk only has 1 gigabyte of it full and the rest is free, we're only going to charge you 3.2p. So that 119 really is kind of like a worst case scenario of how much you would charge for a VM. Yep.
You said the VM comes with 120 gigs attached to it. You are truly using it to simply temporarily power suspend the machine. What happens to that?
Yep, good question. So if the VM has attached storage and you suspend or shut down that virtual machine, then what happens to the storage and kind of how much are you charged as well? Yep, so when a VM is running, there's 2 bits to it. There's the resources you're using. Let's look at that as cores and RAM. And then there's the disk, the storage of the operating system. When it's running, you're paying for those 2 things. If you shut down the VM from outside of the virtual machine itself, so you go into the console and you say shut down, the Azure console, and say shut down, it's called deallocated. And basically what we do is we take the RAM and the processor away from that machine. It's available to someone else. When that happens, you won't pay for that cost. So that 86, when it's shut down, you won't pay for that 86. We need to store that disk for you somewhere, you know, on a shelf kind of thing. And so that's what you would be paying for. When it's shut down, for the VM, the only thing you're going to pay for is the storage. Now, for 127 gig, if I remember correctly, it's something like £4.40 a month, and that was if you were using the whole 127 gig. So you could say for about £3 a month, you could have a machine sitting there that's ready to start up when you needed to. Does that answer your question? Cool. Excellent. Anything else? Yeah, no worries.
Can you do this a hybrid? Can you have a local VM, on-premise VM, and then a cloud-based disk related to
Ooh.
do a blob storage as backup custom store for it?
Yeah, so can you have an on-premise VM, but the storage in Azure? So out of the box with Windows, that isn't possible. There's a number of solutions. So I know of one called Cloudberry, for example. Cloudberry allow you to do exactly that. So I don't have it on my laptop anymore since I upgraded, but I had a Z drive. My Z drive looked like a kind of like a network drive of sorts. It was more like a removable media. That happened to point to storage in Azure, and I think it was 1, 2, 3 terabytes in size it was set up to be. So not out the box with Windows, but you can do it with things like Cloudberry. Okay. So to give you an idea, if you had a 100 gig in this instance, this example I have here, over a year it's £91. And if you had 3.5 gig of RAM, so it's a medium VM, 3.5 gig of RAM and 2 cores, it's going to cost about £1,470 for that year. So my next steps and suggestions would be, do you have any spiky requirements? I do have a requirement for a load of machines that you then need at a certain point in the year, but don't at other years. If there's anybody that requires that, I would say certainly start looking at Azure. And you guys are more seasonal, I would say, than most kind of customers that I speak to. If there's anything you want to move from like a CapEx to an OpEx model, so you no longer want to go and buy a new piece of tin, certainly if you're looking at moving from Windows Server 2003, does anybody have Windows Server 2003 still? Excellent, okay, so that is a good opportunity to think, do I want to move this onto an on-premise server, or do I want to move that into Azure? If that's the case, moving from CapEx to OpEx, certainly look at Azure as well. The best thing to do is to talk to Medhurst. They're going to be able to give you an idea of how other people are using Azure as well. And they'll also be able to expand out into the other areas that I didn't mention. Just to kind of finish off, there's a couple of bits that I did want to go through in the next minute or so. Does anybody have Office 365 at the minute? Yeah? And has anybody switched on the thing that is first release? Yeah, okay, a few people. Okay, so there is something called first release that you can switch on if you're feeling brave. First release enables you to be one of the first people to get a release of the new software, hence the name. So part of that is actually Delve. Delve, if you take SharePoint as being something you can search for documents, but you kind of have to know what you're searching for. You have to know that somebody's uploaded a document about a particular subject. Delve is kind of the other way around. It's where documents come to you. So about once a week, I'll open up Delve, and Delve will tell me that, Harjeet, for example, has been working on a document about how they're going to kind of remove me from the company or something like that. He's not very well hidden that, but I'll have those documents bubble up to me. It uses Office Graph, so it kind of knows who I speak to. Eventually, it'll start to use things like email to figure out who I normally talk and work with. And it uses that information in the same way that Amazon tells you other stuff you should buy when you buy something. We'll do the same with documents. These people have been editing this document. You normally work with them or have interest in this particular area. So Delve is certainly something worth having a look at. There was recently an announcement about using OneNote for education. So if I remember correctly, it's around using it for kind of classroom prep as well as faculty interaction inside as well. Does anybody use OneNote? Few people, actually more than I was expecting. OneNote totally changed my life, wouldn't live without it now. It took me 4 attempts, so for those that haven't tried it, stick with it. OneNote, my top tip would be, if you want to kind of stop using notepads, etc., and that's fine, but you go for a hybrid method, use that and also OneNote. Then if you want to go down that route, you need to find something that will make sense for you. The thing that I do is whenever I go on holiday, I have a OneNote section. I have a section in OneNote for that particular holiday. You know those flight emails and the hotel address, the last things you print out about 20 seconds before you get in the cab to go on holiday? I just email them straight to OneNote. They're already there. The other thing I have in there is my travel insurance. So no matter where I am, I've always got my travel insurance, where I need to, what flight I need to get on, and where I'm going to stay. And all those three things I've got in OneNote, rather than in some piece of paper that I'm bound to lose about 20 seconds after getting to the airport. So for me, OneNote is, that's how I've kind of got used to using it. There are some, yep. Yep.
Is that then relying you being on the internet to access those documents you just listed?
Does it require you to be online to be able to access those? No. So if I was to walk up to your laptop, I can get to those. That's useful if I don't have anything of mine. But on a PC, on a tablet, and on a phone, all of those are synced offline. So you're still able to get to them offline. Good question, though. Thanks. There is some MDM. So MDM was relatively basic in Office 365, so mobile device management. We're about to up that. The other thing to look at is actually something called EMS. So if you're interested in some of the extra areas of like identity management, for example, or rights management for documents, EMS is something to look at, so Enterprise Mobility Suite. It also adds to some of the stuff that's in Office 365 MDM anyway. And the last thing to talk and mention was we've actually got an app that you can now see the status of your Office 365 services. I know it's on the Windows phone. I haven't had an iPhone for about 2 years now, so I can't tell you whether it's on there as yet. And if the admin portal is anything to go by, the partner admin portal app, this admin app for the phone, I would expect quite soon to be able to add, remove users, and make some more kind of detailed changes than just seeing the basic kind of information. You can certainly do it through the partner admin app, so it feels like it's something that would get switched on pretty soon. With that, and being 6 minutes just slightly over, I have finished my part of the presentation. Hopefully that's given you some idea of how you might use Azure. I'm going to be around after for lunch time, so if there's any questions, feel free to ask. I'll just do one more if that's okay, guys. Yep. Yeah. So, so the question is, who is using Office 365 beyond Pilot and Test? Okay, and put your hands down if you're the other one. Okay, so that feels like most people have actually gone beyond Pilot and Test. As out of interest, who's using it? And it's one of those keep your hands up kind of thing. Who's using it for email? It's like an obvious one. What about for SharePoint as well? And OneDrive? Okay, all right, interesting. There's some people using it for OneDrive and not SharePoint. That I wouldn't expect. Okay, cool, thank you. Hopefully that answers your question as well. Cool, thanks. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Much appreciated. I'm going to hand over to Dave now. Thank you.